Now here we are going to do an exercise in which we are going to estimate the GDP under the demand approach. This is the information that we have. We have one column for production and the other is for sales, where sales is also consumption, because if someone is buying, it's because other one is selling. So selling and consumption is the same thing. So here we have different kind of goods: raw material, consumption goods, and equipment goods. When we are talking about raw material, are those elements that are going to be part of a final good, but it doesn't mean that they are already in a final good. In fact, we are going to say that only the raw material that has been sold is in a final good. Otherwise, it's going to be production that is not yet in a final good, but is production. So for our estimation of the GDP, we should consider that part of production that is not yet in a final good, but is actual production. Probably in the coming years it's going to be part of a final good. In that case, we are going to need to correct that inputs that are there that was done a year before, for example. But well, let's go back to the information that we have here. Not just raw material, also we have consumption goods. We are going to assume that the economic agents that is consuming those goods are households, okay, families, households. Equipment, that is going to be for the case in which the economic agents that is buying those goods are firms, are companies, okay? So let's go to the formula for the GDP under the demand approach, demand or expenditure approach, as you prefer. So here we have GDP that is going to be equal to consumption by households, investment, so it's consumption, but in this case by firms, public spending, where is the government the one that is buying, export, when it's the rest of the world, so other economies, the one that are buying our goods, minus imports, when we are buying from abroad. Okay, here we don't have any information about the government when it's consuming, so this value is going to be 0. Neither about international trade, so export and import in this case also are going to be 0. We have consumption because here we have consumption goods, so when we are talking about families, in fact we know that if we are estimating the GDP under the demand approach, the demand here, so the consumption is going to be this value, 600. So we already have this value. Let's go to the next economic agents, so firms. Here we have two elements. When a firm is buying a good, equipment good, or a building, or something like that, it's not just machines to produce, also can be a car, also can be a building, as I said. That is going to be gross fixed capital formation. If we talk about just gross capital formation, is the whole investment. But when we are talking about gross fixed capital formation, that fix is when we are just focusing on equipment goods. Okay? So we are going to have a part which is just going to be consumption of in that kind of goods. So gross fixed capital formation, and then we need to add inventory investment. Where inventory investment is the way of correcting our demand approach. If you remember, here we are assuming that the whole production is demanded. So if we are observing the demand of the consumption, we are going to get the estimation of the production of the GDP. But that is not always the case. That's why we need this variable to make that correction, okay? So, what is going to be the first element? As I said, is when a company is buying. So we need to focus once again in the column of sales, because sales are demand, are consumption, and not in the case of production. So this gross fixed capital formation is going to be this value, equipment goods, sales, so consumption is 300. And now we need to do the inventory investment, which is the difference between production and consumption. and always is going to be in that order, okay? Production minus consumption. Always that the production is higher than the consumption is going to have a positive sign, and we are going to find a negative sign in the opposite case. I mean, when production is smaller than consumption. So we are going to do this for the three kinds of goods that we have. Let's start for consumption goods, for example. So here we have this production and this consumption. If we are just observing consumption, we are going to make a mistake, right? Because the actual production is higher than the consumption. But thanks to this, we are going to introduce that production that is higher than the consumption. So we are making that our final approach is going to be good, it's going to be perfect. So 800, which is production minus consumption, is going to enter with a positive sign in the investment. So we are going to correct that estimation of the GDP that only observes consumption. Next, for the equipment goods, here is going to be this value minus this value. Once again, here in this case we are observing a production that is higher than the actual consumption of this kind of good. So if we are just observing consumption, we are going to make a mistake. We are not considering part of the production. But now, thanks to that, so here we have 750 minus 300 with a positive sign. We are going to fix that problem. And also we need to do the same thing with the raw material. Because imagine that is positive. It's not the case. Here is going to be a negative value. But imagine for a while that this is higher than this. In that case, the thing that we are observing is like more raw material produced than the one used. So that part that is produced but is not in a final good, it can be one of these, for example, is actual production. So we need to consider that as production of this year. Okay, so in that case it's going to be with a positive sign. But here we have just the opposite. This value is smaller than this one. So it's like we are selling more, so someone is buying more than the actual production. How is that possible? Because probably firms that are the provider of that raw material have raw material from previous year. So it's not real production of today. When here there are people who is buying this raw material, they are consuming raw material that is coming from a year ago, for example. It's the only way of selling more than the actual production. It's because that production, part of that production is coming from previous years. So in that case, the thing that we are doing is introducing, when we are observing this consumption, that is going to be in these goods, the thing that we are getting there is that part of that goods, some of the elements that are behind of those goods was produced not this year, but 1 year before. So that is the only way in which the consumption of those elements is higher than the actual production, because part of those elements were done 1 or 2 years ago. So when we are observing the final consumption of these goods, the thing that we are observing is, in a certain way, part of the production that is coming from other years. And that is a mistake when we are estimating the GDP of 1 year, when you are introducing production that is coming from previous years. So here, the thing that we need is something that is correcting that, but in this case, instead of adding value, is subtracting that value. And in fact, if you do the same mechanism that we have done, so the same procedure, in this case we are going to have a negative sign, because it's going to be 200 minus 250, so the result is minus 50. So we are getting that, we are correcting that problem that was coming from just observing final goods, this kind of good, the value of those goods, without taking into account that part of the element that were behind those goods, so the prices of those goods, was production done in years, in previous years. so that element is going to be negative. So here finally we have got the inventory investment, that is, as I said, the difference between production and sales for each category. That value is going to be 600. And so consumption, that was that value, 600, plus gross fixed capital formation, 300, plus inventory investment, 600. So the final result of the GDP under the demand approach, given this kind of data, is going to be 1,500 monetary units.